welcome. So I know that folks in our virtual audience can't hear everybody in the back of the room like that. We will be repeating questions when it's, critical information. Are we ready to get started?
I think so.
Okay.
All right, so we're going to start by talking a little bit about the history of ROIs and HMIS in King County, since we have kind of gone through a long path, a winding path to get where we are now, and it's helpful to know that history in order to understand why we find ourselves in the place that we do.
Can I ask a quick question first?
Yeah.
What do we mean when we say ROI in this context?
Oh, so ROI means release of information, and it is what clients sign to give permission to have their identifying information shared in HMIS. If they do not sign an ROI, then their information, the identifying pieces of their information would not be shared in HMIS. And we'll go over, of course, that process in more detail. So should I talk about the history, or do you want to talk about the?
So I can talk a little bit about the history. Some of you have been in this long and storied road along with me. Some of you are newer to our HMIS and ROI process. But some years back, we had an HMIS system that was known as Safe Harbors. And the way that system was constructed, each agency had its own relationship to the data system and would have its own ROIs in paper versions, in files. And if someone happened to be working with Chief Seattle Club would have the ROI in their file. And if at a later time or at the same time they were working with someone at Somali Youth and Family Club, they would also sign an ROI, and that would be in their paper file. So it was a very kind of siloed system that people might have multiple ROIs and multiple identities within the HMIS. There wasn't any uploading of information into the system, so someone may have already come in, they've told their story, all their information was in the system, but I didn't know that as a case manager because I was at a different agency, and then I would do it again, collect that same information again, put it in my file. So several years ago, we moved from that Safe Harbor system to Clarity Human Services, which is managed by BitFocus. It's our current HMIS system. And this system has much more kind of built-in transparency and the ability for someone to answer all those initial questions and sign the ROI and have the information there. So when an individual comes to agency number 2, they can just look up and say, okay, we have all that information. We don't need to have you go through it again. We can start at point C or D rather than starting at point 1. Do you want to talk, maybe move on and have you talk, Sarah, about the kind of the ROIs as we moved from one system to the next?
Sure. So it was decided when we were making the transition, in order to kind of, more easily facilitate the transition, that ROIs from Safe Harbors would be grandfathered into the new system, with the caveat that those ROIs are supposed to be uploaded into the new system so that folks can see that there is actually an ROI for this client in our one central system that we can all look at. So there's no question about whether there's an ROI, but it was still okay to use the Safe Harbors ROIs because they last 7 years and in many cases, would still be valid for a client. So we didn't want to revisit the whole issue with clients and kind of disrupt services in that way. We wanted to make sure that there was a way to to kind of keep things moving as smoothly as possible. But part of the changes were that, now there is, because we have a shared system, we do have one ROI for the whole system, which means that clients only need to sign once. So again, if they did sign Safe Harbors ROI and an agency had that on file and uploaded it into the system, then it would be taken care of for 7 years, and it wouldn't be necessary for clients to sign again, to have to go through the conversation with clients again. And if you look and can see that a client has an ROI, then you know that you don't have to broach that conversation with the clients. So that brings us to where we are now, which is getting those ROIs in the system. And so we want to go over the technical process for how to document consent or non-consent in HMIS in our current system. This may be a process that you're all familiar with, but we just want to go through it to make sure that everybody's clear and has that same baseline starting point, and so that you can ask any questions that you might have.
And
Danny.
before we move further into this technical piece, I guess one more thing to say is why the ROI and what the purpose of it is in the system. And that is if the person has signed the ROI and agreed to have their identified information shared, then the purpose of that is to use it to help people better access services and access housing. So the information is in there and we can be working together collaboratively in the best interest of the person that we're serving.
Right. Because of course, being able to see the whole client's history is much more useful than just being able to know your own agency history. I think that that's actually been really eye-opening. I've heard a lot of comments from folks about having a shared system and kind of seeing that the client does have this whole service involvement outside of just what they have for your agency has been pretty interesting for folks to see.
And also can be helpful if you have a housing resource for someone, it helps you be able to find them if you can see that they're currently served somewhere else. Just slip out of the way.
Danielle's gonna switch up to Danielle.
So I'm going to really quickly go through the actual, like, this is how you do the ROIs piece. So here, to upload an ROI, you find the privacy shield for the client, open it up, add a release of information. This is the training site. So in the live system, this will default to 7 years, and the training site, it only defaults to 2. And the start date will default to the date that you're entering it. So like if the release was signed 3 days previously, make sure that you update that start date. There's now 2 options for documentation. There's an electronic signature option and an attaching the PDF option. Attaching the PDF is the one that's been kind of around the longest. So when you select documentation attaching a PDF, it will give you the option of finding a file. Find the file you're looking for. It will tell you right here when it's been completed. Add the record. And then it'll tell you here which type of consent it was. So if this was an electronic, it would say electronic here. If you want to view it or print it out, you can always open it back up. To add an electronic consent, you go through the same process. Click on the shield, add a release of information, permission, yes, dates, documentation, electronic signature. You can sign the e-document. Down at the bottom, there's a signature box. If you have like an iPad or something, the client can sign with their finger. If you're at your desktop, the client can click and drag with the mouse.
Just let me interrupt a second. So the documentation that's above is the actual release. So you can have clients view it on the screen right there and go through it. So they'll be seeing the same information that's on the paper form.
Yeah. So once they sign, make sure you hit apply. Or if for some reason the signature didn't work, you can always reset it. Re-sign, hit apply, and then save. This will then tell you that the e-sign document is complete. Add the record, and it'll tell you here that the type is electronic signature. If the client wants a copy or you want a copy for your records, you can open it up here with this little icon. It'll show the signature, it'll have the date that it's signed and the client's name.
And how can you tell if your client does or doesn't have an ROI on file?
You can tell by opening their privacy shield and looking down here. Is there a second way to tell?
No, just
Okay.
that. But what does it look like if they don't have one?
If they don't have an ROI on file, there will be here, it'll say no results to display.
And so with this electronic system, so no ROI file, that doesn't mean that Michael Quinn doesn't have one in his file folder at his desk. It may exist, but as far as the system knows, there isn't an ROI.
Just a note about where to find the ROIs. This is the King County HMIS page. When you click on forms and guides, down here at the bottom are the client forms. This is the release of information. This is revocation of consent, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then there is a recently updated ROI frequently asked questions.
And we highly recommend that you check out the frequently asked questions because so many of these questions are common, different kinds of scenarios. And so we try to cover them all so that you have the information.
Okay, a couple special cases with ROIs that we wanted to note. In the cases of families, so if you're doing the electronic signature for families, for each of the children's profiles, you'll need to open up that child, have the parent or guardian sign. So it'll show up with the parent, when you go to print it off, it'll show up with the parent or guardian signature and then the child's name. Parent or guardians can sign for minors. Clients cannot sign for spouses, significant others, children over 18. Yeah. So the question was, can someone still sign for an adult if they have guardianship? And the answer is yes. If they have legal guardianship, they can sign for the adult child or spouse.
Or power of attorney.
Or power of attorney. Yeah. Other special cases are veterans. So if you're working with a veteran who has signed a VA ROI, if you do the paper HMIS consent, continue to scan them together and upload them as one document. If you have them sign the electronic consent, the VA ROI can be uploaded here under Files. So you'll have two ROI locations, but that's only if they sign electronic consent.
And this is because for those in the veterans program, in order to be able to access those programs, there's an additional
Yes.
ROI.
Yeah.
So if I got a family, I need a ROI certificate.
Yes. The question was, if you have a household with children, do you need HMIS consent for all of the children as well? And the answer is yes. If they are identified in the system, they need HMIS consent uploaded, signed and uploaded. Oh, and then, so one quick thing add on to that is creating a de-identified client, which I'm gonna run through really quickly. So to add a client, search, add a client.
So this is when your client does not consent to have
yes.
their identifying information in HMIS. You create a de-identified profile, their enrollments and all that information, and the information attached to their enrollment is still tracked in HMIS, but we just, those personally identifying pieces of information, we have to de-identify them in order to share information.
Yes.
So that's what.
And there's a difference between creating a de-identified profile and de-identifying an existing profile. Do we talk about that later, or should I talk about that now?
We do talk about it.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So this is if a client comes to you and is like, I don't want my information in the system, I'm not giving consent. So social security number is client refused. Last name should be refused.
And social security number is all zeros. That's what triggers the system to know that the client is de-identified.
Yes. Quality of name is client refused. Date of birth is client refused.
And all these sorts of details are in the basic training and in.
Yes. Yes. These demographics, you can collect and enter the actual data for. You create an identified client. Make sure that you still go to that client to the Privacy Shield, add a release of information. Where it says permission, change it to no, and then just add the record. That way it'll still show up as a de-identified client, and it will show that the consent was declined.
Can you show them what they need to do with the name? And
Oh,
the
yes.
identifier?
And again, we're going through this very quickly. This is not intended as a full-on training about this, but just sort of to kind of point out the basic points that hopefully you've seen before, but also can follow up on later.
Yeah, these steps are in the user manual and they're on the HMIS website.
of course, when you're adding a date of birth for a de-identified client, you do 1/1 for the month and day, and then a year within 3 years of the actual date of birth, 3 years or more. And you want to be conscious of the fact if you're serving populations whose age may impact their eligibility for services, that you think about that when entering that date of birth. You don't want to age them out of services if they're a young adult, or make them too young for services if they're somebody who would qualify for services for somebody over 65.
So when you initially create the client, you want to make the first name, and this should actually be consent. Make the first name consent, the last name refused. As soon as you create that profile, this unique identifier is created. Copy this unique identifier, make it the client's first name, and save changes. That way you don't have all like 15 different clients with the name consent refused. Also, if you have any internal agency tracking ID numbers, you can add those in the alias field as well, so that you can keep track of your consent refused clients. A question here?
Somebody noted that for gender, race, and everything, you said data not collected versus client refused. And then somebody else chimed in that actually you could.
Yes.
So can you speak to both of those?
Yes. So I did data not collected just for ease of creating a client on the spot in the training without having to think about things. So for gender, race, ethnicity, and vet status, those are not considered protected information, so you can enter those accurately.
And if your client still refuses to, does not want that information, there's a safety reason not to, then client refused
Yes.
would be the answer.
Yes.
That was the question here.
Yeah. So data not collected was just what I used for the training, not an example that you should follow. We talked a little bit about if a client is a brand new client, has not been in the system before, how to enter them as a de-identified client. If a client comes to you and is revoking consent, always, always, always reach out to our help desk instead of changing the names yourselves, because there are names that are kind of in hidden places that might get missed. So we want to make sure that if a client becomes de-identified, that their name in all of the potential places is removed. Clients.
Additionally, clients may be working with multiple agencies, and our help desk will do their best to reach out to other agencies to let them know that a client is being de-identified, so that they don't lose track of that client when suddenly they can no longer find them by their name.
If a client is revoking consent, there is a revocation of consent form. This form is not needed for clients who are actively fleeing DV, but may be requested from our help desk for clients who are revoking in other circumstances. And that can be found on the web page that I showed earlier, the King County HMIS page.
But we do have to have that revocation of consent form before the help desk will de-identify a client if it's a situation where it is required. Just like clients are required to sign to give consent, they're required to sign to revoke that consent as well.
Can some clients in a family be de-identified and others identified?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. If there is safety concerns or some of the special circumstances that we're about to talk about, the answer is a little bit different. But if a client just does not want their identifying information in the system, and that's all there is to it, there's no safety concern, then yes, some members can be de-identified and other members can be identified. So now we're going to talk about some of these more complicated scenarios and some of the scenarios where there are legal requirements around consent or non-consent. So the first one, which is the one we probably get the most questions around, is domestic violence. So there are essentially two different realms of consent with regard to folks who are dealing with domestic violence situations. So the first one is for agencies that are victim service providers, and if you are, you know that you are. In that case, clients exist in sort of their own separate silos for each of those agencies. All clients for victim service providers are de-identified. They have one profile per agency that they seek services with, and there's no overlap between those profiles. And those profiles are never merged. Even if you work for a victim service provider and you know you have a client in common with another victim service provider, you would never seek to merge those profiles. They always stay completely separate so that they can never be identified and tied back to any particular client. The situation that's a little less black and white is for agencies who are serving those who are actively fleeing. Now, we underline actively fleeing because we want to make sure that it's clear that this is just for folks who have a safety concern around fleeing domestic violence, not necessarily somebody who has experienced domestic violence at some point in their life and is not facing an active safety concern, but this is really for folks who are just actively leaving a situation and could be in danger as a result. The answer to whether their information is identified or not in the system is not cut and dried. It's a matter of the client's determination of their own safety. So it's best to evaluate the client's safety with them, and then they can decide whether they feel safe having their identifying information in the system or not. If they do not, of course, it is no problem at all to de-identify them or to contact the BitFocus help desk to have them de-identified. They don't need to do the revocation of consent process because it is a safety concern. And if you're in doubt, if you're unsure whether they should be identified or not, it's also fine to de-identify them in the interest of making sure that they are safe. But it's not by default that they have to be de-identified. If they feel like they would rather have their identifying information in the system because of other services that they're connected with, or because they know that there's no chance that their abuser could get access to the system, then that's really up to them. And along with that, if they want to use their unique identifier to share with other agencies so that if they do have a de-identified profile, but they also want to make sure that they, are still connected to services, or maybe they are, they're on the community queue and they don't want to lose that, they don't want to miss out on any opportunities because now their profile is de-identified, they can use their unique identifier at other agencies and have still one shared profile, even though it's de-identified. So any questions about domestic violence before we move on?
Not yet.
Okay, great. All right, the next one is for clients who have HIV, who are HIV positive or who have AIDS. So this one is also a little bit complicated. So just because clients are HIV positive does not mean that they need to be de-identified in the system. They only need to be de-identified if you're going to be documenting that HIV positive status in HMIS. We don't want to tie it back to them, to their identifying information, but if that information is not going in the system, then they don't actually need to be de-identified unless, of course, they choose to be de-identified, like any client can choose that. It used to be that every program enrollment collected HIV status. We have removed that question for all programs except those that are receive funding through HAPWA. That's the only program that actually requires that we ask that question. So now you shouldn't even have an opportunity to document that information in the system. So you shouldn't need to worry about disclosing it in the system such that you're then required to de-identify clients. Again, you can de-identify clients, but you only are required to do so if you're documenting their HIV status and they have a protected HIV status in the system. And so again, they can share their unique ID. If they are de-identified, they can share their unique ID with other agencies so that they can keep one profile throughout the system to avoid duplicates. And I forgot to mention, but if you're an agency that uses scan cards, then that's even easier because the scan card has their unique identifier regardless of whether they're identified in the system or not. So you can take that to they can take that to other agencies and be connected to their profile easily that way. Any questions about protected HIV status? Unaccompanied minors are the last sort of special situation. So only adults are legally able to consent to have their identifying information in HMIS, which means that if you serve unaccompanied minors, they must be de-identified in the system. And of course, minors are anybody under 18. But again, clients can share their unique identifier with other agencies. You can give them that identifier, or maybe again, if you're using scan cards, they can take that identifier to other agencies. They can have one shared profile in the system, but that profile cannot be identified. or cannot contain identifying information. All right, so we talked about this a little bit before. We're going to talk a little bit about approaching the ROI, what you might see in the system, and how to handle different kinds of scenarios with regard to whether or not an ROI may or may not exist. So as we mentioned, if possible, if at all possible, check a client's ROI status before you meet with them, if you have the opportunity to do so. That can resolve a lot of questions right off the bat. You can see that they maybe already have an ROI in HMIS, and if that's the case, then nothing more is needed. You don't need to have the conversation with them. You can just move on to the actual work that you want to do with them. You're not making sure that the profile exists. You're actually looking to make sure that there is an ROI in the system, which you can do under that little green privacy shield on a client's profile. So if there is no ROI on file, then you need to get one on file, which you can do in a variety of different ways. If your agency has a history of serving this client, then you may already have an ROI signed for this client. You may have a current one under our current HMIS, or maybe you have an old Safe Harbors one. Either way, grab that ROI and upload it into the system, and the ROI issue is done. Again, you don't have to have the conversation with clients. The ROI is taken care of. If you don't have an ROI, if the client is new to you, but you can see in their history that they've been served by other agencies, then those agencies should have an ROI on file for the client that hasn't yet been uploaded. So you can reach out to them to get the ROI. And again, not have the conversation with clients, but just get that ROI uploaded into the system. You can ask them to upload it. You can ask them to get it to you so you can upload it. Either way is fine. And then, of course, if those aren't options, then hopefully you can have a conversation with your client about consenting to having their identifying information in HMIS. Again, electronic signatures make this process much easier. If they have identifying information in HMIS already, you can frame the conversation that, we see here that you have consented to have your information in the past. But we just need to, have you sign this document to confirm that we see that I know that it's missing, or, something, it looks like another agency didn't add it to the system, whatever the case may be. Can I just get your signature here, and here's the form? That way, you don't have to worry. You don't have to kind of start the conversation from scratch, because they've already been through it with some other agency and did give consent, because otherwise their identifying information wouldn't be in the system. But this way, it might be a way to just kind of ease the conversation along quickly, get the signature, and then just move on to actual services. So then this is a question that comes up all the time. What if my client has an ROI in HMIS, but they say that they don't consent? So in that case, really, like, as we talked about, they have to go through the revocation of consent process, which means completing the form, and then you would contact the help desk. It's also the opportunity for you to have a conversation with your clients about why they're not consenting. Sometimes clients have concerns about the kind of information that's being tracked in the system. You can actually show them their client information screen so that they can see that information. Sometimes it's reassuring to see that it's actually not a huge amount of information and that the scope is pretty limited. And also, talk with them about, of course, what their concern is, why they're no longer consenting, and see if you can allay that concern. If there's a reason that they're not consenting that you can address. All right, coordinated entry and non-consent. So, of course, the most important thing when you have a client who is on the community queue awaiting a housing referral is that you want the coordinated entry folks to be able to contact your client. If they have no identifying information in the system, that makes it extremely difficult, in fact, impossible for them to contact your client. So if you have a new client who you are serving and you are referring to them to the community queue for the first time, maybe you're an assessor, you've assessed them and you're referring them to the community queue, you must fax your client's contact information to coordinated entry for all so that they have that contact information, since they won't be able to get it in the system because your client is de-identified. So that's a very key step. If you are serving a client who's on the queue and they are revoking consent, this is another reason why it's super important to contact the help desk if your client is revoking consent, because the help desk will work with you to make sure that the coordinated entry folks get your client's contact information so that they can still be reached when a housing opportunity becomes available for them. And if in doubt, really, if you're dealing with this whole consent issue and you're just not sure, this is all a big jumble in your head and there's so many different options and you're not sure, just contact the BitFocus help desk. They will help you navigate the process and figure out what steps need to happen and when and with who, and make sure the right people are contacted, and get it all taken care of. So always, if in doubt, the help desk is your friend.
Anything else? Great. Thank you, everybody, for your time.